Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you all are enjoying your life and relaxing right now, cause it's time for true off the chest Reddit stories with Minecraft gameplay. She betrayed our 4-year long relationship for her office colleague. I still remember the way the light hit the kitchen counter that Tuesday morning, reflecting off the ceramic mug Sarah had bought me for our 3rd anniversary, because that was the last morning I actually believed my life was perfect. You know that feeling when you're so comfortable in a relationship that you stop looking for red flags, not because you're lazy, but because you genuinely think you've found your person and the world is finally quiet? That was me, sitting there at 32 years old, thinking that after 4 years of building a life with Sarah, we were untouchable. We had the shared bank account, the lease on a beautiful 2-bedroom in Chicago, and the kind of unspoken shorthand where we could hold an entire conversation just by glancing at each other across a crowded room. But looking back now, I realized that the silence I mistook for peace was actually the sound of a foundation cracking right under my feet, and the person I trusted more than anyone in this world was already halfway out the door. It all started with a promotion Sarah got back in October, a senior marketing role at a firm downtown that came with a massive pay raise and, as it turned out, a whole new set of priorities. She was so excited when she got the news, and I was genuinely proud of her because I'd watched her pull 80-hour weeks to prove herself to partners who barely knew her name. We went out to this expensive steakhouse to celebrate, and I remember she spent half the dinner talking about her new team, specifically this guy named Julian who was supposed to be her right-hand man for the upcoming regional campaigns. At the time, his name didn't mean anything to me. He was just another colleague, another character in the story she told me about her day. She described him as intense but brilliant, the kind of guy who knew how to close a deal before the client even realized they were being sold to. I cheered for her, I toasted to her success, and I had no idea I was basically celebrating the beginning of the end of my own happiness. The shifts were subtle at first, the kind of things you excuse because you want to be a supportive partner and you don't want to be that guy who gets jealous over nothing. It started with her phone staying face down on the coffee table, a habit she'd never had in the 4 years we'd been together. Then came the late nights, which made sense given the new role, but the way she talked about them felt different. She wasn't complaining about the workload anymore. She was glowing with the adrenaline of it. She'd come home at 9 p.m., smelling like the cold Chicago wind and expensive espresso, and instead of collapsing on the couch with me to watch whatever show we were binging, she'd go straight to the shower. When she came out, she'd be back on her laptop, her face illuminated by the blue light, a small, private smile playing on her lips that she didn't seem to realize was there. I'd ask her how the day went, and she'd give me these vague, polished summaries that sounded like she was reading from a corporate memo, always mentioning how we managed to solve a crisis or how we were heading out to a site visit the next morning. I tried to bridge the gap, I really did, because I could feel the distance growing like a physical wall between us. I'd plan weekend getaways or even just suggest a quiet night in with no phones allowed, but she'd always have an excuse. There was always a deadline, a mandatory mixer, or a quick strategy session that ended up taking 6 hours on a Saturday afternoon. I started feeling like a ghost in my own apartment, watching her move through our life like she was just visiting, like her real life was happening somewhere else, in a high-rise office building with people I didn't know. The intimacy started to fade, too, and not just the physical part, but the emotional vulnerability that makes a long-term relationship feel safe. She stopped telling me her fears, stopped asking for my advice on things, and started treating me like a roommate she happened to share a bed with. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was just the growing pains of her career taking off, but deep down, in that primal part of your brain that knows when you're being hunted, I knew something was rotting. The first real crack appeared in December during her company's holiday party, an event I'd been looking forward to because I finally wanted to put faces to all these names she kept dropping. Sarah had been stressed about her outfit for weeks, which was unusual because she's always been effortlessly stylish, but she seemed desperate to impress a specific crowd. When we got there, the atmosphere was thick with expensive perfume and the kind of forced laughter you only hear at corporate events. She introduced me to her boss and a few designers, but her eyes were constantly scanning the room, looking for someone else. When she finally spotted Julian, her entire body language changed. She stood taller, her voice went up an octave, and she practically pulled me over to where he was standing by the bar. He was exactly what I expected, tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my car, and possessed that kind of practiced charisma that feels both inviting and incredibly dangerous. "Mark, this is Julian, the genius I've been telling you about," she said, and the way she looked at him wasn't the way a boss looks at an employee. It was the way someone looks at a prize. Julian shook my hand, his grip firm and his smile perfectly symmetrical, but his eyes never quite reached mine. They were darting back to Sarah, catching her gaze in a way that felt incredibly intimate, like they were sharing a joke I wasn't allowed to hear. We stood there for 10 minutes, and I've never felt more invisible in my life. They talked about projects and inside office drama, using jargon and names I didn't recognize, and every time I tried to contribute to the conversation, Julian would politely acknowledge me and then immediately pivot back to Sarah. It wasn't overt disrespect, it was worse. It was complete indifference. He didn't see me as a threat because, in his mind, I already wasn't in the picture. On the Uber ride home, I tried to bring it up, trying to keep my voice steady so I didn't sound like I was accusing her of anything. I told her that Julian seemed a bit intense and that I felt a little left out of the conversation. Sarah didn't even look at me. She just stared out the window at the passing city lights and sighed, a sound full of exhaustion and a hint of annoyance. "Mark, don't start," she whispered, her voice cold. "He's my colleague, and we're under a lot of pressure. You're overthinking things because you don't understand the environment I'm working in right now." That was the first time she'd ever used that tone with me. The one where she implied I wasn't smart enough or successful enough to understand her world. It stung more than any insult could have, and for the rest of the night, we lay in bed back to back, the silence between us feeling heavy and suffocating, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. Over the next month, the work calls started happening later and later. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. to find the bathroom light on, and I could hear her whispering into her phone, her voice soft and animated in a way it hadn't been with me in months. When I'd ask who she was talking to at that hour, she'd claim it was a global client, in a different time zone, or an emergency project update. I wanted to believe her so badly that I let myself be lied to. I convinced myself that if I just worked harder at being a good partner, if I cooked more, cleaned more, gave her more space, she'd come back to me. I was playing a game where the rules kept changing, and I didn't realize that I was the only one still trying to play. Sarah had already checked out. She was just waiting for the right moment to tell me. Or maybe she was waiting for me to find out so she didn't have to be the bad guy. The breaking point for part 1 came on a Friday in late January. Sarah told me she had to go to a retreat about 2 hours outside the city for the weekend, a team-building exercise to prep for the Q1 launches. She seemed nervous while packing, fluttering around the bedroom and avoiding eye contact. I offered to drive her, but she insisted that Julian was picking her up because they needed to go over the deck during the drive. I stood at the window and watched as a sleek black Audi pulled up to our curb. Julian didn't get out. He just waited. Sarah grabbed her bag, gave me a quick, dry peck on the cheek that felt more like a chore than an expression of affection, and walked out the door. As I watched her get into his car and saw him lean over to say something that made her laugh, that genuine, head-back laugh she used to save for me, I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. I spent that entire weekend alone in our apartment, surrounded by 4 years of memories that were starting to feel like lies, staring at my phone and waiting for a text that never came. That weekend she was away felt like a slow-motion car crash I couldn't look away from. I tried to stay busy, cleaning the apartment until my knuckles were raw and going for long runs in the freezing Chicago wind, but every time I sat down, the silence would just scream at me. She barely texted, just a few one-word replies to my "hope you're having fun" messages, claiming the reception was bad at the lodge. But I knew the area they were supposed to be in, and I knew for a fact the reception wasn't that bad. My mind started going to dark places, imagining them in a dimly lit bar or a quiet hotel room, and I hated myself for it. I felt like a cliché, the suspicious boyfriend pacing the floor, but my gut was screaming that the woman I loved was currently building a life with someone else while I was sitting at home guarding the ruins of ours. When she finally came home Sunday night, she looked different. There was a sort of afterglow about her that she tried to hide behind a mask of exhaustion. She walked in, dropped her bags, and barely acknowledged me, heading straight for the shower again. I noticed a small thing then. Something so minor most people would miss it. But when you've known someone for 4 years, you notice when the rhythm of their soul changes. She was humming a song she'd never mentioned before, a slow, indie track I'd heard playing in Julian's car that morning he picked her up. It was such a small detail, but it felt like a physical blow to the chest. She wasn't just working with him. She was absorbing him. She was letting him into the private spaces of her mind where I used to live. The next few weeks were a blur of cold shoulders and gaslighting. Every time I tried to talk about us, or the distance I felt, Sarah would flip the script. She'd tell me I was being suffocating, or that my insecurity was making it hard for her to focus on her career. She started comparing our life to the lives of her successful friends, subtly hinting that we were stagnant. She'd talk about Julian's ambitions, his investments, his vision for the future, and then she'd look at me, a guy with a stable but unglamorous job in logistics, with a look that was somewhere between pity and resentment. I was no longer her partner. I was a weight she was dragging along, a reminder of a version of herself she was trying to outrun. I started to realize that betrayal isn't always a single moment of infidelity. Sometimes it's 1,000 tiny choices to prioritize someone else's attention over your partner's peace of mind. The real evidence fell into my lap in the most mundane way possible. It was a Tuesday evening, and Sarah had gone to late yoga after work. She'd left her iPad on the kitchen island, and it kept buzzing with notifications. Usually, I'd respect her privacy, but the screen caught my eye because a name popped up that I didn't recognize. Jay. Not Julian, just Jay. And the preview of the message wasn't about marketing or Q1 launches. It said, "I can still smell your perfume in my car. Can't wait for Friday." My heart didn't just drop. It felt like it stopped beating entirely. My hands were shaking so hard, I almost dropped the device as I swiped up. She hadn't locked it. I shouldn't have looked, but I couldn't stop myself. It was all there. Months of messages. It didn't start with sex. It started with emotional venting. Sarah complaining about how I didn't get her anymore. Julian validating her, telling her she deserved someone who matched her energy, someone who could keep up with her. Then it turned into flirting, then photos, nothing explicit, but intimate, and then the retreat. The retreat hadn't been a team-building exercise at all. It was a weekend at a boutique hotel in Galena. There were photos of them by a fireplace, Sarah looking happier than I'd seen her in years, leaning into him while holding a glass of red wine. The betrayal wasn't just the physical act. It was the fact that she had been auditioning my replacement while I was still standing right in front of her. She had been mocking my insecurity to the very man she was proving me right with. I sat there on the kitchen floor for an hour, the iPad glowing in the dark room, feeling like the entire world was made of glass, and I'd just watched it shatter. I wanted to scream, to throw her things out the window, to call Julian and threaten him, but a strange, cold calm took over me. It was the calm of total clarity. I realized that the person I had been mourning for the last few months, the Sarah who loved me, who was my best friend, didn't exist anymore. This person who was coming home from yoga was a stranger wearing her face. I didn't say anything that night. I put the iPad back exactly where it was and went to bed. When she came in, smelling of expensive soap and looking refreshed, she asked if I was okay. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "Yeah, I'm just tired." She didn't even notice the change in my voice. She was too busy checking her phone under the covers. I spent the next week like a ghost, gathering my things and making a plan. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break down because I knew she'd just use my reaction to justify her choices. "See? He's unstable. That's why I left," she'd tell Julian. I wasn't going to give her that. I contacted a lawyer about the lease and the joint account, quietly moving my half of the savings into a private one. I found a small apartment across town and signed the papers in secret. Every night I'd sit at dinner with her, listening to her lie about her day, watching her pretend to be my girlfriend, and it was the most surreal experience of my life. It was like watching a movie where I already knew the ending, but I had to keep sitting in the theater until the credits rolled. The escalation hit its peak when Sarah told me she had to go on another business trip to New York for 5 days. She was so brazen about it now, barely even trying to make the lies sound plausible. She told me Julian was going too, but only because the client requested him specifically. I watched her pack her nicest dresses, the ones she used to wear for our anniversary dinners, and I realized she was going to New York to play house with him. She was going to see what a life with him felt like before she officially cut me loose. The sheer cruelty of it, leaving me to watch her dog and take out her trash while she was across the country with her lover, was the final straw. I realized then that I didn't just want to leave. I wanted her to understand exactly what she had thrown away. The day she left for New York, I didn't take her to the airport. I told her I had a work emergency and had to leave early. She didn't care. She was probably relieved she didn't have to pretend for the 40-minute drive. As soon as her Uber pulled away, I went into overdrive. I called a moving company I'd pre-booked. I'd already packed my things into boxes labeled charity and hidden them in the back of the closet over the last few days. By noon, the apartment was half empty. All my furniture, my books, my kitchen supplies gone. But I didn't stop there. I took every single photo of us, every card she'd ever written me, every memento of our 4 years together, and I put them in a single box in the middle of the empty living room floor. I left her key on top of that box, along with a printed transcript of the messages I'd found on her iPad. I didn't write a long, emotional letter. I didn't beg for an explanation. I just wrote one sentence on a sticky note. I hope he's worth the 4 years you just burned to the ground. Then, I walked out, locked the door, and changed my phone number. I didn't want to hear the excuses. I didn't want to hear her cry. I just wanted to be gone before she realized that the safe, home base she was coming back to didn't exist anymore. But as I drove away, I saw something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. Julian's car was parked 2 blocks away from our apartment, and he was sitting there, watching our building. He wasn't at the airport. He was waiting for her to leave so he could come over to our place. They hadn't even waited for the plane to land in New York to start their new life in my bed. The first few weeks after leaving were a blur of cold takeout and sleeping on a mattress on the floor of my new studio apartment. I felt like a limb had been amputated, and the phantom pain was constant. I'd reach for my phone to tell Sarah something funny I saw, only to remember that she didn't exist to me anymore. I stayed off social media, knowing that seeing her perfect, new life with Julian would be a poison I couldn't recover from. But the world is small, especially in professional circles in Chicago, and word started getting back to me. Apparently, Sarah hadn't just been dating Julian. She had been his secret for months while he was also seeing 2 other women in the office. The brilliant Julian was a serial predator who targeted ambitious women in his department, using the promise of career advancement and emotional connection to manipulate them. I heard through a mutual friend that when Sarah got back from that New York trip, which, as it turned out, Julian had canceled on her at the last minute, leaving her alone in a hotel room for 3 days, she walked into an empty apartment and realized I was gone. The friend said Sarah was devastated, which I found hard to believe. You don't get to be devastated when you're the one who pulled the trigger. She tried to call me hundreds of times, but since I'd changed my number and blocked her on everything, she was just screaming into a void. For the first time in her life, Sarah had to face the consequences of her actions without anyone there to soften the blow. She had traded a 4-year foundation for a man who didn't even show up for the flight. The climax of the whole mess happened about 2 months later. I was finally starting to feel like a human being again, focusing on my work and actually enjoying the silence of my own space. I was at a coffee shop near my new place when I saw her. She looked terrible. The glow was gone, replaced by a kind of haggard, haunted look that made her seem 10 years older. She saw me before I could leave, and she practically ran over, her eyes welling up with tears. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just need 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to explain." Against my better judgment, I sat down. Not because I wanted her back, but because I wanted to see if there was any of the old Sarah left. She told me everything. How Julian had dumped her 2 weeks after I left because the thrill of the chase was gone. How he'd moved on to a new intern and was now actively trying to get Sarah pushed out of the firm because she was too emotional and a liability. She cried about how she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, how she'd let her ambition and a shiny new toy blind her to the man who actually loved her. She told me she still slept on my side of the bed because it still smelled like me, and that she'd kept that box of photos I'd left, looking at them every night. She looked at me with this desperate hope, like she expected me to reach across the table, take her hand, and tell her it was all going to be okay. I sat there and listened to her, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sad. I just felt nothing. It was the strangest sensation, seeing the woman who had been my entire world reduced to this crying stranger, and realizing that the version of her I loved was just a character I'd helped create. The real Sarah was the one who was willing to lie to my face for months. The real Sarah was the one who could watch me struggle and feel nothing but annoyance. I looked at her, and I didn't see my future. I saw a lesson I'd finally finished learning. I didn't yell. I didn't throw her betrayal in her face. I just waited for her to finish, took a sip of my coffee, and stood up. "Sarah," I said, and my voice was so calm it surprised even me. "I'm sorry you're hurting. I really am. But you didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. Every single day for months, you chose to lie to me. You chose to let Julian into our life. You chose to treat me like I was invisible. You didn't lose me because of Julian. You lost me because you stopped being the person who was worth staying for." The look on her face was one of pure, raw realization. It was the moment she realized that there was no reset button, no amount of crying that could rebuild the trust she'd systematically dismantled. I walked out of that coffee shop, and I didn't look back, not even when I heard her call my name one last time. The aftermath wasn't some grand victory, but it was a quiet sort of peace. Sarah ended up leaving the firm a month later. Rumor has it she couldn't handle seeing Julian every day, and moved back to her parents' place in Michigan to find herself. Julian, as men like him often do, stayed exactly where he was, protected by his sales numbers and his charm, though I heard he eventually got HR investigated for something else. As for me, I kept my small studio. I kept my new phone number. I started dating again, but slowly, with my eyes wide open this time. I learned that you can love someone with everything you have, and it still won't be enough if they don't love themselves enough to be honest. I still have that ceramic mug, the one she bought me for our anniversary. I don't use it for coffee anymore. It sits on my desk and holds my pens. It's a reminder that things can look beautiful on the outside, even when they're empty. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about that Tuesday morning, the last one where everything was perfect, or if she's already replaced that memory with the image of the empty apartment I left her. But then I realize it doesn't matter. My life isn't a story about her betrayal anymore. It's a story about my survival. And as the sun sets over the Chicago skyline, I realize that the silence I once feared isn't empty at all. It's finally, after a very long time, full of me.